This video analyzes the game played between Capablanca, who played with the white pieces, and Madison, who played with the black pieces. The code of the opening used was E38. This opening is called the Nimzo-Indian, classical, 4, C5. Result, white won the game. What is the first move of the white player? White, pawn moves to d4. The popular impression of king's pawn openings is that they offer all sorts of opportunities for whipping up a quick attack. A variety of gambits can be played, pieces may be sacrificed to open lines, combinations ventured on, and speculation indulged in anything for the sake of mate. Sometimes these tactics succeed, but very often the gambit player finds himself at the wrong end of the attack, as wide open positions are as dangerous for one side as for the other. In queen's pawn openings, the ideal to strive for is development for its own sake. The attack is not the be-all and end-all. It is not deliberately played for, but, strangely enough, the very fact that all the pieces are developed economically, that they are put to work as quickly as possible on the squares where they function best, seems to imbue them with marvelous powers of attack. Combinations come into life out of nothing. Can it be that the simple posting of pieces where they have the greatest freedom of movement and the greatest command of the board generates in them so much dynamic energy that it must be released somehow? And can it be that knowledge of this fact is what makes the virtuosi of positional play repress their instinct to attack until the time is ripe for an attack to be unleashed? White's move of the d-pawn begins the process of getting all the pieces into play as quickly as possible. Two of them are now free to make their debut, while the pawn that released them occupies the center of the stage. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6, a developing move, whose object, besides the commendable one of bringing a piece to its most suitable square, is to prevent white from gaining too much ground with 2.e4. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c4. This move does many things. 1. It begins an attack on the d5 square. 2. It keeps the c-file open for the use of the heavy pieces. 3. It offers the queen a diagonal. 4. It hinders black from establishing a pawn in the center by 2 black d5, as white's reply 3 pawn from file c takes at d5, compelling a recapture with a piece would leave black with no pawn in the center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e6. Black clears a path for the dark squared bishop and indicates that he will go in for an active defense. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to c3. White's motive is evident, he develops the b1 knight first, to support an advance of the e-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b4. To this, Black counters by clamping a pin on the knight. If white were to play 4.e4, then 4 black knight takes at e4 would leave him helpless to recapture. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to c2 with a twofold purpose, to meet 4 black. Bishop takes at c3, check. With 5. Queen takes at c3, keeping white's pawn structure intact, and to threaten again the advance 5.e4. There is a prevalent concept that in the opening there is a best move at every point. The belief is that the chess master memorizes every one of these best moves and its proper reply. That such reasoning is specious is obvious. The very fact that millions of games have been played without duplication of moves is proof enough in itself. Let us consider the position on the board. Besides the text move, 4 queen moves to c2, there are at least 7 excellent alternatives, each of which has enthusiastic advocates. They are, 4 queen moves to b3, 4 bishop moves to d2, 4.a3, 4 bishop moves to g5, 4.e3, 4.g3, and 4 knight moves to f3. Which of these is best? No one can say for sure, but the move that leads into positions congenial to your style is the best move, and the one you should play. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c5. Black too can conduct the defense, or the counter-attack, in the manner that suits his style and temperament. The move he plays immediately disputes white's control of the center. It does other things, too. It gives the queen more scope, opens the c-file, protects the bishop, etc. However, there are other moves, equally effective, at black's disposal. He can select from these replies, each of which has something to recommend it. 4 black knight moves to c6, 4 black d6, 4 black d5, 4 black castles on the king's side, and 4 black b6. There is something for every taste. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file d takes at c5. Strongest for various reasons. White does not lose time in taking the pawn, as black in recapturing will return the lost tempo. The open d file resulting from 5. Pawn from file d takes at c5 will benefit white, who will occupy d1 with the rook and exert pressure along the length of it, especially endangering the backward d pawn. Other continuations are less energetic. For instance, after 5.e3, black frees himself by 5 black d5, while after 5, knight moves to f3. Pawn from file c takes at d4 6. Knight takes at d4. Knight moves to c6. White has lost the initiative. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to c6. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been castles on the king's side. Black develops another piece before recapturing the pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, Knight moves to f3, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to a3, somewhere about this stage, the amateur wants things to happen. He begins to look around for surprise moves. There must be a brilliancy in the position. The great master, in the same situation, is content to make simple moves. He knows that if he keeps on bringing pieces into play, there will be no need to look for winning combinations. They will evolve naturally out of the position and spring up all over the place. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at c5. Further delay in recovering the pawn might be dangerous. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to f4. The aggressive 7. Bishop moves to g5 is more usual, to pin the knight and keep black under pressure, but no fault can be found with this method of development. It looks mild, but the bishop surveys an important diagonal and bears down on d6, a tender spot in black's position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to d5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to e5, vigorously challenging white's possession of the center. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e3. Another quiet move which liberates one bishop and strengthens the position of the other. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a5. Black spies a chance to start an attack which will result in saddling white with an isolated c-pawn, a slight positional weakness, so he begins an action against the knight, but such artificial maneuvers, says Tartakower, can hardly succeed against a Capablanca. Black should instead do something to get his c8 bishop into play, for example 8 black a 6-9. Bishop moves to e2. Pawn from file d takes at c4 10. Bishop takes at c4 b5 11. Bishop moves to e2. Queen moves to b6, not at once 11. Black bishop moves to b7 on account of 12. Knight takes at b5, 12. Castles on the king's side. Bishop moves to b7. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to e2, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been rook moves to d1, yet another modest move, but it is packed with more energy than you might suspect. It accomplishes these objectives. 1. It activates a piece, by getting it off the first rank. 2. It develops the bishop at e2 so that it can move to f3 and attack the center. 3. It clears away the king's side, making early castling possible. 4. It prepares the cooperation of the rooks on the first rank, subsequent to castling. What was wrong with playing the more aggressive looking 9? Bishop moves to d3? For one thing, the reply 9 black knight moves to b4 enables black to force an exchange of knight for bishop. White would lose the services of a piece valuable for its potential influence on the center. Why not then prepare to develop the bishop at d3 by playing 9.a3 first? The answer is that time is too valuable in the opening to waste on unnecessary pawn moves. Only those pawn moves that are essential to the development of pieces should be made. The additional circumstance that 9.a3 weakens the light squares on the queen side is more proof that such strategy is artificial and time-wasting. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b4 in contrast to white's classically simple method of development. Black moves the same bishop a third time in the opening, in order to inflict his opponent with an isolated pawn. Such an attempt is premature in view of black's incomplete development. Instead, a plausible continuation is 9 black castles on the king side 10. Castles on the king side pawn from file d takes at c4 11. Bishop takes at c4 bishop moves to d7, when black has a fair game. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, castles on the king side. The king is made secure, while the h1 rook moves closer to the center, the theater of action. The rook, of course, will try to seize an open file, or, if none is available, one which is likely to be opened. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at c3. The bishop has moved 4 times to make this exchange for a knight that has moved only once. So much shifting around of one piece indicates that the strategy behind it must be faulty. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file b takes at c3. Despite white's doubled c-pawn, he enjoys these advantages. 1. He has 2 active bishops against black's knight and bishop. 2. All of his minor pieces are in play while black still has a bishop on the first rank. 3. His rooks are in touch with each other and ready to seize the half-open b and d files. 4. His king is safely tucked away in a corner while black's is out in the open. 5. His queen is ideally posted and has more influence on the center than does black's, standing at the side of the board. 6. An exchange of pawns in the center, which looks inevitable, will open lines of attack, a circumstance that favors the player whose development is superior, in this case, white. 7. He maintains the initiative. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, castles on the king's side. One of black's difficulties is resolved with his king's escape to safer quarters. Developing the bishop instead was somewhat risky, since after 11 black bishop moves to d7 12. Rab 1, attacking the b7 pawn, 12 black b6 13. Bishop moves to d6. White stops kingside castling and threatens 14. Rook moves to b5, queen moves to a6 15. Pawn from file c takes at d5, pawn from file e takes at d5 16. Rook takes at d5, and the discovered attack on the queen wins a pawn for white. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file a moves to b1, another of those subtle moves, whose purpose the average player usually fails to see. What use is it, he says, to waste a rook move in attacking a pawn that is adequately protected? True, the pawn is defended, but by a bishop which cannot develop without abandoning the pawn. Sooner or later, black will be compelled to play black b6, or have three pieces on his first rank interfering with each other. There are drawbacks to black b6, though. For example, black's queen will be cut off and prevented from returning to the king side and the defense of the king. In addition, his c6 knight's position will be insecure, once the prop, the b7 pawn, is removed from under it. White's move is simple and quiet, but it exerts uncomfortable pressure on black's queen side, makes normal development difficult, and creates permanent weaknesses which lend themselves to exploitation. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to a3, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn from file d takes at c4, black wants to develop his bishop, and for that purpose he must play black b6, but to do so at once might endanger the queen by cutting off her line of retreat. For instance, 12 black b6 13. Bishop moves to d6, rook moves to d8 14. Rook moves to b5, queen moves to a6 15. Pawn from file c takes at d5, rook takes at d6, 15. Black pawn from file e takes at d5 permits 16. Rook takes at d5, discovering an attack on the queen, 16. Pawn from file d takes at c6, rook takes at c6 17. Knight moves to d4, rook moves to c7 18. Rook moves to e5 wins material, as 18. Black queen moves to b7 loses after 19. Bishop moves to f3, knight moves to d5 20. Bishop takes at d5 leading to a surprising back rank mate following 20. Black pawn from file e takes at d5 21. Rook moves to e8, checkmate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, rook from file f moves to d1. With the posting of this rook on the partly open d file, white's development has been completed in an ideal way, every piece taking its best post in no more than one move. White has not so much as hinted at an attacking combination until every piece has been put to work. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to b6 to enable the bishop to come out, but the advance of the pawn takes away the c6 knight's support and weakens its position. Guarding the b-pawn by 13. Black queen moves to e7 instead does not help much, since the bishop cannot develop at d7 next move without cutting off the queen's protection of the pawn. Nor can black try to simplify by 13. Black pawn from file d takes at c4 as the reply 14. Bishop moves to d6 wins the exchange. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn from file c takes at d5. The attack begins. The first blow destroys black's pawn center. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight takes at d5. The recapture with the pawn. 14 black pawn from file e takes at d5, is bad in view of 15.c4. Black could not then escape by 15 black pawn from file d takes at c4 since 16. Bishop moves to d6 attacks queen and rook, while protecting the pawn by 15 black bishop moves to e6 yields to 16. Pawn from file c takes at d5 bishop takes at d5 17. Rook takes at d5 knight takes at d5 18. Queen takes at c6, and white has won 2 pieces for a rook. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to g5, a masterstroke. The brutal threat of 16. Queen takes at h7, checkmate. Disguises the two real purposes of the move, the strategic concept of forcing black to move one of his kingside pawns, thereby loosening the defensive structure, and the clearance of the f6 square for the benefit of the dark-squared bishop, who will bear down heavily on the long diagonal. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to f5, this was a mistake. A better move would have been pawn moves to g6. Black had 2 alternatives. 1. 15 black knight moves to f6 avoids moving one of the pawns, but 16. Bishop moves to d6 wins the exchange. 2. 15 black g6 leaves black's position riddled with weaknesses on the dark squares. Therefore, black moves the pawn, staving off the mate, but it weakens his e-pawn and ties the bishop down to its defense. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to f3. This arrangement of bishops gives them tremendous raking power along the 2 parallel diagonals. White's chief threat is 17. Rook takes at d5, pawn from file e takes at d5 18. Bishop takes at d5, check. King moves to h8 19. Bishop takes at c6 followed by 20. Bishop takes at a8, sweeping away a good part of black's army. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, queen moves to c5, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to h6, the queen rushes to the aid of the vulnerable knights. This is what happens on other defenses. 1. 16 black and e7 17. Bishop moves to d6, queen moves to a5 18. Bishop takes at e7, knight takes at e7 19. Bishop takes at a8, and white wins a whole rook. 2. 16 black and ce7 17. c4 knight moves to b4 18. Rook takes at b4, queen takes at b4 19. Bishop takes at a8, and white wins a piece. 3. 16 black knight takes at f4 17. Bishop takes at c6, rook moves to b8 18. Pawn from file e takes at f4, and white has won a piece. 4, 16 black queen takes at c3 17. Queen takes at c3 knight takes at c3 18. Bishop takes at c6 knight takes at d1 19. Rook takes at d1 bishop moves to a6 20. Bishop takes at a8 rook takes at a8, and white is a piece ahead. After black's actual move, he seems to have escaped the worst, but white has an ingenious way to get at the knights. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c4. The stab at the knight looks harmless, the pawn being pinned and unable to capture, but the point of 17.c4 is to use the pawn to support an attack by 18. Rook moves to b5. This will drive the queen off and make the capture 19. Pawn from file c takes at d5 possible. The combinations now appear in quick succession. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight from file d moves to b4, this was a blunder, a better move would have been knight takes at f4, counter-attack on the queen. All other attempts at defense fail, viz. 1, 17 black knight moves to f6 18. Bishop moves to d6 queen moves to a5 19. Bishop takes at c6 and both black's rooks are end prize. 2, 17 black knight takes at f4 18. Rook moves to b5. A pretty in-between move, 18 black queen moves to e7, alternatively 18 black knight moves to b4 19 queen moves to d2 queen takes at c4 20 rook takes at b4 and white wins, 19. Bishop takes at c6 queen takes at g5 20. Pawn from file e takes at f4, and the attack on the queen leaves black no time to save his a8 rook. 3, 17 black and de7 18. Bishop moves to d6 queen moves to a5 19. Bishop takes at e7 winning a whole rook. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to b3 white's queen must move, but the threat of 19. Bishop moves to d6 hangs over black like the sword of Damocles. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e5 not only because there is no other antidote to 19. Bishop moves to d6, but with the hope of curbing the terrible bishops by putting obstacles in their paths. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to a3. This starts a beautiful combination at one end of the board which culminates in a queen sacrifice followed by a smothered mate over at the other end. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to a6, this was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen moves to e7, the only other move, 19 black pawn from file e takes at f4, allows white to force the win by 20. Pawn from file a takes at b4 queen moves to e7 21. Bishop takes at c6 rook moves to b8 22. Pawn from file e takes at f4, and the extra piece wins easily. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at c6 after the recapture 20 black queen takes at c6, there comes 21.c5 plus king moves to h8 22. Knight moves to f7, check. King moves to g8, or 22 black rook takes at f7 23 rook moves to d8, check. And white forces mate, 23. Knight moves to h6, check. Plus king moves to h8 24. Queen moves to g8, check. Rook takes at g8 25. Knight moves to f7, checkmate. Black did not wait to be convinced by a demonstration over the board but turned down his king in surrender. 1-0, an exquisite game played with elegance and precision. Capablanca's own comment on it was, "I made a few little combinations in this game.